The woods had a way of swallowing sound. Even the wind seemed cautious there, slipping between the trees instead of rushing through them. Locals said that once you crossed the tree line, the air felt heavier, as if the forest itself was listening. At the center of that silence stood a farmhouse gone gray with age, its windows dark, its porch forever empty. Behind it, half hidden by tangled branches and rot, waited the barn. No one in town spoke openly about the woman who lived there. They spoke around her instead, lowering their voices when her name came close to their lips. She had arrived decades earlier with children no one remembered being born, boys who grew tall and quiet and never left. They were seen only at dawn sometimes, working the land with their heads down, moving as if each step required permission. The barn was the strangest part. It had no markings, no paint, no sign of purpose, yet it was always locked. At night, faint noises drifted through the trees, footsteps where no one should be walking, murmurs that didn't carry words, cries that were quickly cut short. Those who heard them learned not to ask questions. The woman said the world beyond the woods was corrupt. She said family was all that mattered. She said blood must remain pure, protected, obedient. Her sons learned these lessons early, carved into them through years of fear, devotion, and isolation. To outsiders, they looked like grown men. To her, they were still children, still hers to command. What happened in that barn was never meant to be seen. It was hidden by trees, by silence, by a mother who understood that the deepest horrors survive best when no one dares to look too closely. The woman had chosen the woods deliberately, not by accident or desperation, but with careful intent. Long before the town noticed her absence, she had already vanished into the trees, hauling her children and what little they owned down a dirt path that barely qualified as a road. The forest closed behind them like a door quietly shut. To her, isolation was safety. Distance meant control. The farther they were from neighbors, schools, churches, and questions, the easier it would be to reshape the world into something that obeyed her rules alone. She told her sons the woods were alive and angry, that strangers brought disease, betrayal, and sin. She said the town despised families like theirs and waited only for a chance to tear them apart. The boys grew up believing that the shadows beyond the trees hid enemies, not people. Each story she told reinforced the same lesson. Survival depended on staying close to her, listening to her, trusting only her. Over time, the idea of leaving stopped feeling like a possibility and began to feel like a crime. The farmhouse became the center of their universe. It was old even when they arrived, its boards warped, its roof patched in places where rain had already found its way in. She liked it that way. Broken things, she believed, were easier to shape. The boys slept in small rooms, rose before sunrise, worked until their hands hardened and their backs ached. They were not allowed to wander far. Every path had a boundary she enforced with fear and punishment disguised as love. The barn came later. At first it was only a storage space, a half-collapsed structure she insisted needed repairs. She watched as her sons rebuilt it plank by plank, teaching them patience, obedience, and silence. By the time it stood tall again, the barn no longer felt like part of the land. It felt separate, purposeful, forbidden. The lock appeared soon after, heavy and new against weathered wood, a detail that did not go unnoticed by the boys. To the outside world, the family became a rumor. People remembered seeing the woman once or twice in town years earlier, her eyes sharp, her voice calm but commanding. After that, there were only glimpses of her sons at a distance, always together, always silent. No mail came to the farmhouse. No visitors stayed. Seasons passed, then years, and the woods kept their secret well, allowing the woman to raise her sons in a place where no one interrupted, no one questioned, and no one heard what lessons were truly being taught inside that isolated hollow deep among the trees. The barn did not draw attention at first because nothing about it seemed remarkable in daylight. It stood a short distance behind the farmhouse, its shape softened by vines and shadows, its roof sloping unevenly as if it had grown tired of standing. From the road, it was barely visible, and most people who passed the area never noticed it at all. It was only after dark that the barn began to announce its presence, not through sight, but through sound. Neighbors living miles away started to mention strange disturbances, usually as jokes at first. Someone claimed they heard singing carried on the wind, thin and uneven, like voices unsure of the words. Another spoke of dull thuds echoing late at night, too rhythmic to be falling branches, too heavy to be animals. On certain evenings, a pale light flickered between the trees, steady enough to suggest intention but weak enough to vanish if anyone tried to follow it. No one ever saw flames or lanterns, only the suggestion that something inside the woods was awake when it should have been sleeping. Those closest to the forest noticed more. Dogs refused to go near the tree line after sunset, pulling at their leashes and whining as if they sensed something wrong. Hunters complained that game vanished from the area surrounding the farmhouse, leaving the woods eerily empty. Even the air seemed different on that side of the land, thick with a smell that could not be named, part damp wood, part rust, part something faintly human. When asked, the woman dismissed it all as imagination, weather, or animals, her tone polite but final. The sons never spoke of the barn, but their behavior changed. They avoided looking toward it during the day and moved with stiff urgency whenever night approached. Tasks that once took hours were rushed to completion, as though darkness carried consequences they did not dare test. Occasionally, one of them could be seen standing near the barn door, motionless, listening, his face drained of expression, as if he were waiting for something to finish rather than begin. The lock on the barn door remained closed at all times, gleaming strangely against the rotting wood. It was new, solid, and unmistakably intentional. When questioned by a passing surveyor years later, the woman smiled and said it was to keep animals out, though no animals were ever seen near it. The explanation satisfied no one, but the woods had a way of discouraging curiosity. With every unanswered question, the barn became less a structure and more a warning, a place defined by what it refused to reveal, whispering to the surrounding land that some doors were never meant to be opened once night fell. The first sign of rebellion came quietly, almost unnoticed, the way a hairline crack appears in a wall before the collapse. One of the sons began lingering at the edge of the property longer than the others, stretching chores until dusk, pretending to search for tools or check fences that did not need repair. He listened to sounds beyond the trees, sounds his mother had sworn did not belong to them. Laughter once drifted faintly from far away, carried by the wind, and it unsettled him more than fear ever had because it sounded ordinary, human, real. He started asking questions, carefully at first. Why they never went into town. Why no one ever visited. Why the barn was locked even during storms. His mother answered with the same calm certainty she always used, telling him curiosity was a weakness planted by outsiders. She warned him that disobedience invited ruin, that the world beyond the woods punished those who forgot their place. Her words had always been enough before, but now they slid past him, leaving something restless behind his eyes. One night, he left. There was no dramatic escape, no packed bag or shouted farewell. He waited until the house slept, until the forest settled into its usual hush, and then he walked. He did not look back at the barn, did not allow himself to think of what waited there. He followed the narrow path he had memorized over years of forbidden glances, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain it would give him away. Each step away from the farmhouse felt unreal, like crossing into a story he had only heard described. By morning, the woman knew. She always knew. The remaining sons were ordered to search, their faces pale, their movements automatic. They found him less than a mile away, near the edge of the trees where the forest thinned and the world opened just enough to offer false hope. He did not resist when they took him. He did not scream. His silence frightened them more than struggle would have. When they returned, the woman embraced him with trembling hands, whispering relief and forgiveness. To an outsider, it might have looked like mercy. To her sons, it was a warning. That night, the barn door opened longer than usual. The sounds that followed were different, sharper, filled with something broken and final. Afterward, the son who had tried to leave no longer asked questions. He avoided the tree line entirely. His shoulders sagged, his eyes dulled, and whatever dream had driven him toward freedom was stripped away and buried deep where even memory could not reach, leaving the others to understand that escape was not just forbidden, it was impossible. The town had always whispered about the family, but it took decades before anyone looked closely at the records that might explain their isolation. A young clerk at the courthouse noticed inconsistencies while sorting through property deeds and tax papers, small anomalies that didn't make sense on paper. The land had been transferred multiple times over the years, often under different names, sometimes without proper documentation. It was as if the family existed in two places at once, officially recorded but invisible, like a shadow that refused to align with light. When these details were cross-referenced, they hinted at something more than secrecy. They hinted at deliberate erasure. Locals who remembered seeing the family decades earlier became reluctant witnesses. Old-timers spoke in half-sentences about how the children seemed to appear fully grown almost overnight, how the mother's face never changed even as the seasons passed, how no one ever saw the men outside the boundaries of the farm. Small details, insignificant alone, formed a pattern too strange to ignore. Neighbors recalled letters that never arrived, visitors who were turned away with a politeness that felt like steel, and animals that vanished from the surrounding land, leaving behind an unnatural quiet. The closer someone looked, the more impossible the family seemed. The property records added another layer. Surveys showed structures that no longer existed and buildings whose construction dates contradicted any reasonable timeline. Old tax assessments indicated livestock that was never reported in town but could be inferred from the size of barns and outbuildings. Each entry was a fragment of a puzzle deliberately scattered, as if someone had gone to painstaking lengths to make the family's existence seem ordinary while hiding the extraordinary horrors inside. Even the barn, carefully obscured by foliage and time, appeared in records only as a nondescript storage building, a detail that reinforced the illusion of normalcy. The more the townspeople dug, the more they realized they had overlooked subtle warnings for generations. The silence around the property had never been passive. The woman had enforced her isolation with patience and precision, teaching her sons how to appear normal from a distance while keeping the truth concealed behind fences, doors, and rules that seemed mundane but were anything but. Official documents, casual memories, and local anecdotes all converged to reveal a single fact. The family had been deliberately hidden, not merely by geography but by careful manipulation of everything the outside world could see. What was once considered eccentricity now began to resemble premeditated concealment, a meticulous effort to hide the reality of what the woods and the barn held from anyone who might pry too closely, leaving the town to slowly recognize that the truth was far darker than any rumor could have suggested. The case began quietly, almost by accident, when a young woman failed to return from a hike in the woods near the outskirts of town. At first, it seemed like a typical missing person report. She had wandered too far, gotten lost, maybe stumbled into a creek or hidden ravine. Search parties combed the forest for days, calling her name into the wind, scanning every hollow and underbrush, but the dense trees swallowed both sound and light, leaving them with nothing but faint impressions of movement and broken branches. Still, something about the area near the old farmhouse felt different. A tension hung in the air that could not be explained by nature alone. As authorities approached the perimeter of the property, the forest seemed to push back. Dogs refused to enter, whining and scratching at their leashes. Officers felt an inexplicable heaviness in the air, a pressure that made them sluggish and distracted. Windows of the abandoned farmhouse were opaque with age, reflecting nothing, showing only a distorted image of the forest beyond. No footprints marked the paths to the barn, no disturbances betrayed the life inside. Yet the sounds continued, faint shuffling, a low murmur, almost like whispered conversations, but always just out of reach. Each investigator who paused to listen felt a chill, as if the forest itself were warning them to step back. The missing person case brought outsiders closer than anyone had dared to go in decades. Locals who had spoken in whispers suddenly had witnesses, their memories re-examined in light of official concern. Old rumors gained credibility, and the barn that had once been a curious anomaly became a focal point of unease. Investigators scoured the property lines, tracing faint trails, peeling back layers of foliage, noting every structure and anomaly, every detail the family had so carefully hidden. Each day yielded small hints, tiny glimpses of human presence that didn't belong to the natural forest. A discarded shoe, a broken lock, a trace of smoke from a stove long unused. The clues were subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to suggest the possibility of something hidden and ongoing, something beyond ordinary neglect or isolation. Even as search efforts intensified, the family remained unseen. The sons were never observed directly, and the mother's presence was only implied through the strict order of the land and the invisible rules that seemed to govern the forest itself. The investigation forced the world to confront the edges of the woods, revealing the first cracks in a barrier that had stood unchallenged for decades. Every question asked, every footprint followed, drew them closer to the truth, yet no one knew exactly what they would find. The case transformed from a routine search into a slow, creeping awareness that the farmhouse and barn were not abandoned, they were deliberately hiding something, a secret that had remained untouched, protected by fear, silence, and generations of careful isolation, waiting for the moment when the outside world might finally stumble upon it. The mother's obsession with blood began as whispers and rumors, dismissed by those who could not imagine the depths of her control. Over the years, the forest became more than a home, it became a sanctuary and a laboratory, a place where she could enforce rules without interference and shape her family according to her singular vision. She spoke often, quietly, of lineage and purity, insisting that the outside world was corrupt and that only the blood within her household could remain untouched. To her sons, these ideas were neither abstract nor theoretical, they were law, drilled into their very bones through a mixture of instruction, fear, and relentless surveillance. She reminded them constantly that obedience was not optional and that their lives were inseparable from her designs. Her belief in preserving blood dictated every movement within the property. Every meal, every chore, every moment of leisure was framed around compliance and loyalty to her will. She monitored conversations, punished hesitation, and celebrated moments of complete acquiescence. Silence was a virtue, resistance, no matter how small, invited correction. She told them that outsiders were contaminants, threats that could taint the lineage she had sworn to protect. Every trip beyond the farmhouse, even a simple errand to a distant creek or a path to collect firewood, was regimented and scrutinized. Nothing was incidental. Every detail was another chance to impress upon her children that they belonged entirely to her designs, and that the blood they carried was both treasure and weapon. The barn, once a simple storage space, became the tangible embodiment of her ideology. She controlled it with precision, dictating when her sons could enter, for how long, and what tasks they might perform inside. To her, it was not merely a structure, it was an instrument of maintenance, a place to ensure her rules were absolute, to reinforce the connection between obedience and reward, and to remind her children of their place. The sons learned to move without hesitation, to anticipate her expectations before she voiced them, because any deviation could have consequences far beyond physical punishment. The barn became a silent teacher, reinforcing the lessons she preached, that family loyalty was paramount, that blood was sacred, and that freedom was an illusion unless it aligned with her will. Even as her sons matured, they remained under the psychological grip she had forged, understanding implicitly that their lives, their desires, and their very bodies were extensions of her obsession. The forest, the farmhouse, the barn, they were all instruments in a single design, a world she had constructed where her ideology could persist unchallenged. Within these boundaries, her power was absolute. Fear and devotion blended seamlessly, creating a home where the unnatural became routine and where the line between love and domination was so blurred that her sons could no longer recognize its edges. In the stillness of the woods, under her careful watch, her vision of purity shaped every heartbeat and every choice, leaving no room for escape, no space for dissent, and no way for the world outside to intrude upon the dominion she had so meticulously built. The journal was discovered long after the first whispers of the family had faded into rumor, hidden beneath loose floorboards in the farmhouse where the wood had begun to rot and warp. Its pages were brittle, yellowed with age, yet the ink remained remarkably clear, as if preserved by the secrecy surrounding it. From the first page, it was evident that the entries were not mere records of chores, weather, or daily life. They were confessions of control, meticulous and deliberate, written by the mother herself. Each sentence carried an unflinching attention to detail, a careful observation of her son's behaviors, moods, and compliance. Every deviation from her expectations was noted, catalogued, and analyzed as though she were both parent and judge, observer and orchestrator. The journal revealed the methods she had used over the years, strategies that were subtle yet devastating in their effectiveness. She documented the ways she instilled obedience, how small rewards and minor punishments were administered to reinforce her ideology, and how she fostered an absolute dependence on her authority. Fear and devotion were intertwined, each entry showing how she monitored the boys' responses, tested their loyalty, and corrected even the slightest hint of disobedience. She wrote about the moments she could see them questioning, moments when curiosity flickered across their eyes, and how she extinguished it before it could grow into rebellion. It was not merely discipline, it was a calculated shaping of minds, an indoctrination so thorough that the sons themselves could scarcely recognize their own autonomy. The entries also exposed her reasoning, the philosophy that had justified her actions in her own mind. She wrote at length about purity of blood, about the dangers of outsiders, about the necessity of controlling her family to preserve what she saw as sacred. Her words were chillingly rational, devoid of moral conflict, presenting her domination as protection rather than cruelty. Every justification was carefully layered, building a framework in which the unnatural became necessary, the horrifying became routine, and the son's compliance became proof of her wisdom. The more the journal unfolded, the clearer it became that the horror of their lives was not incidental or born of chaos, it was intentional, structured, and executed over decades with precision. Even the mundane details of daily life were part of her control. Meals, work, sleep, the timing of each activity, everything was observed, measured, and recorded, creating a map of psychological dominance that extended far beyond physical space. The journal was not only a record of events, it was a blueprint, a testament to the totality of her control, and a revelation of the terrifying precision with which she had shaped her sons into obedient instruments of her ideology, leaving behind a paper trail of fear, manipulation, and unbroken authority that would haunt anyone who dared to read it. The truth of the barn emerged slowly, like a shadow stretching across the forest floor at dusk, revealing itself in pieces too horrifying to comprehend all at once. It began with a single surviving witness, a distant relative who had been sent to deliver supplies years earlier and had glimpsed more than anyone should have. She spoke of an interior that defied normal description, of spaces rearranged not for comfort or storage, but for control. Heavy chains and reinforced partitions, doors that opened only at her command, narrow stalls that seemed designed for observation rather than labor, all pointed to a place where the ordinary rules of family and life had been twisted into something unrecognizable. Her account was hesitant, fragmented by fear, but the core was clear: the barn was no barn at all. It was a mechanism, a vessel of the mother's ideology made manifest. Investigators who followed the testimony were unprepared for what they would find. Every surface bore signs of occupation that suggested rigid schedules and strict oversight. Floors were scuffed in patterns that implied movement dictated not by necessity but by routine enforced through intimidation. Items left behind, tools, simple furniture, feeding troughs, had been arranged with precision, each placement reinforcing surveillance and obedience. Even the smallest details told a story of long-term psychological domination: scratch marks in the wood, remnants of locks, the faint odor of chemicals or waste preserved in the air. It was clear that the barn's design had evolved alongside the mother's obsession, becoming more intricate and restrictive over the years, a physical manifestation of her control. The sons, when questioned years later, could speak only in fragments, often contradicting themselves, unable or unwilling to recount the full truth. Their recollections, pieced together with the witness accounts and forensic evidence, revealed the barn's purpose in horrifying clarity. It had been a place where obedience was tested, where loyalty was reinforced through fear, where every movement was monitored, and every instinct suppressed. It had been the stage on which the mother enacted the principles she had written in her journal, a controlled environment where reality bent to her ideology and no one, not even her own children, could escape the system she had built. The barn's very structure reflected her twisted logic. Windows were small and placed to minimize visibility, doors allowed entry but controlled exit. Spaces were partitioned so that interaction could be supervised and behavior punished or rewarded with surgical precision. Nothing was accidental. Even the forest outside seemed to serve her purpose, the trees masking the structure from prying eyes, creating a natural barrier that reinforced isolation. The surviving witness, trembling as she spoke, emphasized one final, chilling detail: the barn had never been a place of work or storage. It had been a place of control, a calculated environment where every design choice, every corner, every locked door was meant to shape lives in her image, leaving a legacy of terror and obedience that could not be undone. The confrontation came unexpectedly, without warning, and it changed everything the sons had ever known. Years of careful obedience and silent compliance had created a fragile equilibrium, a balance maintained by fear, routine, and the mother's unyielding authority. But that balance began to shatter when one of the sons, older and more aware than the rest, hesitated in a way he never had before. It was a small pause during a routine task, barely noticeable, but to the mother it was a spark of defiance, a signal that the system she had built so meticulously was vulnerable. She sensed it immediately, and the household tensed as if the air itself had thickened in anticipation. The confrontation did not happen in grand gestures or shouted accusations. It was quiet, almost mundane in its execution, yet every word carried the weight of decades of control. She spoke to her sons in the same calm, measured voice she had always used, but this time there was an undercurrent of menace that cut through the habitual obedience. The sons felt it, a tension that pressed against their chests, making it hard to breathe, hard to think clearly. The mother outlined her expectations with meticulous precision, reminding them of everything they had been taught, everything they owed to her, and everything that awaited them if they failed. Yet, beneath her careful language, the cracks in her control were evident, and the sons began to recognize that the world they had been taught to fear was not entirely beyond reach. One by one, they were forced to confront their own memories, their own desires, and the choices they had never been allowed to make. The eldest son, who had once tried to escape, stared at the barn, at the locks, at the darkened corners where shadows lingered like ghosts, and realized that submission was no longer a certainty but a decision. His hesitation spread like a ripple through the others, each boy forced to weigh fear against the faintest glimmer of freedom, obedience against the possibility of self-determination. For the first time, the mother's authority was not absolute. It could be questioned, challenged, even resisted. The confrontation escalated slowly, measured in looks, pauses, and unspoken calculations rather than violence. Each movement, each glance, was a negotiation of power, a test of wills sharpened by decades of manipulation. The sons recognized that the world outside the woods might offer nothing but uncertainty, yet within the confines of the farmhouse and the barn, certainty had come at too high a cost. For the first time, the mother was no longer untouchable, no longer the unchallenged center of their lives. And in that fragile, tense space, they were faced with the impossible choice: remain bound to fear and the ideology that had shaped them, or risk everything to reclaim even a fragment of their own lives. By the time the full scope of the mother's actions became known, the damage was already irreparable. The sons, molded for decades by fear, isolation, and the twisted ideology she had imposed, were no longer children but adults whose identities had been overwritten by obedience. Years of control had etched itself into their bodies and minds so deeply that freedom was no longer simply an opportunity, it was a foreign, almost incomprehensible concept. They had been trained to obey instinctively, to equate loyalty with survival, and now that the walls of their confinement were finally breached, the lessons she had drilled into them resisted unmaking. The forest, the farmhouse, the barn, they had all been instruments of a system that had worked with ruthless consistency, leaving them scarred, fearful, and uncertain of who they truly were beyond the shadow of her authority. Even for the town and the authorities who uncovered the truth, the revelation arrived like a slow-rolling storm. Evidence was pieced together painstakingly: journals, witness accounts, traces of occupation in the barn, and the testimonies of the sons themselves, hesitant and fragmented. Each discovery deepened the horror rather than resolving it. People struggled to reconcile the idyllic vision of a remote family with the carefully orchestrated control and abuse that had persisted for decades. The idea that a mother could exercise such absolute dominion over her own children was difficult to accept, and yet the physical evidence and the sons' stories left no room for doubt. The barn, the forest, the hidden paths, they all bore silent witness to the scale of what had been done. Attempts at intervention came too late to prevent the long-term consequences. Psychological and emotional trauma had been layered upon itself for generations, and no external authority could undo the conditioning or erase the fear instilled over years of isolation. The sons were technically free, but freedom without context was terrifying. The world beyond the woods was unknown, chaotic, and unforgiving in ways they had never experienced. Their mother's ideology lingered in their thoughts, in the routines they had internalized, in the instinctive deference that surfaced even when logic told them otherwise. Recovery would be slow, incomplete, and forever shadowed by the knowledge of what had been demanded of them. Even as the case closed, the community remained haunted. Locals who had once passed the woods without thought now approached with caution, their memories of the family reframed in light of the horror revealed. Rumors solidified into grim history, stories that would circulate for generations, a warning of the danger that can fester when fear, secrecy, and control intertwine. The legacy of the mother's obsession persisted in the barn, in the forest, and in her sons, leaving a permanent mark on the landscape and the psyche of everyone connected to it. The truth was out, but it offered no comfort, only the knowledge that some horrors, once fully revealed, cannot be undone, and the shadows they cast stretch far beyond the reach of even time itself.